thank you very much for having me. When I had a useful life as an academic and a constitutional lawyer, I used to get to talk about really interesting things like federalism and vertical fiscal imbalance. And now in my present life, all I seem to talk about is higher education regulation, which invariably gets me onto the subject of TEQSA. So even the modest level of interest that may be involved in Australian federalism is now denied me. And may I say in all sincerity and thanks, I hate you all for having done that to me. And I've been told to talk about the lessons of the journey of higher education regulation, and I intend to concentrate on TEQSA because we're at a critical stage, but I'd signal at the outset that much of what I say is going to be more generally applicable to the wider question of regulation of higher education. And I mean, to call the journey so far a journey is probably right. It's been an interesting journey. It's had more episodes than Neighbours. There was the sort of exciting start when we tried to create a national regulator, and then the point when we had to sort of rescue the attempt, and then the bit when the legislation started to go very well, and then TEQSA was established and was immediately characterised as a threat at least to Western civilisation, if not intergalactic harmony. Tried to do its job, made a few mistakes, now being reviewed and reviewed in a general climate of deregulation. So trying to draw lessons at this point is a little bit like trying to deduce the nature of physics 5 minutes into the first lesson. But what I will try and do is to sort of catalogue the journey and try and draw a few fundamental things that I think apply both in the context of TEQSA and regulation more generally. Now, in terms of the starting point here, I think the starting point is always going to be whether or not we need a national regulator of higher education. Now, I have never wavered in my belief that we need a national regulator. I've always been of the view that the reason that this was explicit in the Bradley report was because of a view that there would be a significant extension of funding to private providers, something of an expansion of higher education, that there was a need for a regulator in these type of circumstances. It didn't quite happen like that. But I think whichever way you look at it, you've got three unassailable reasons why you need a TEQSA. One is the size, complexity and range of the higher education sector. It does need regulatory assurance. One is the Bradley demand-driven system, the very significant number of student consumers that have come into the system. But the other, interestingly enough, is our overseas market reputation. And the reason I say that's interesting is because it predates Bradley. It's not the case that TEQSA is simply a response to Bradley. It's a natural outcome, I think, of directions that have been going on in Australian higher education for many years. So I actually don't think the question is whether there will be a TEQSA. I will resist from bursting into my famous hit, "There'll always be a TEQSA," the Vera Lynn tune. But the question is what type of TEQSA. And in this context, I'll sort of adopt the view of my father, who was a sports journalist, who used to say one should never be frank when there's an opportunity to be brutally frank. I think there has been extravagant criticism of TEQSA at times, which I will modestly label as irresponsible, outrageous and damaging. Damaging because it has distracted TEQSA and hindered its establishment, because it's promoted a sense of threat in an atmosphere that is not conducive to good decision making by anyone, including TEQSA, that old joke about it being hard to remember you're trying to drain the swamp when you're up to your neck in alligators, and that in fact we've got into a position where we've got a debate around trying to resist an aggressive regulator, which has not necessarily been helpful for the development of policy. And I reject that extravagant view of the national regulator and of TEQSA. I am not saying, note, that I think TEQSA is perfect, and I can illustrate that. I think it is certainly true that sometimes TEQSA has made bad decisions. I think in actual fact there is a direct correlation between the type of atmosphere I've talked about and some of the less good decisions, that a besieged regulator is always going to find it harder to regulate. And sometimes it even means that criticism from critical friends is interpreted as direct attacks on the regulator. So my basic thesis is we need a regulator and we need a TEXA. The real question is, what type of regulator do we need and how is it to discharge its functions? And I think we can get an awful lot of lessons, not only about the type of regulator, but about the type of regulation, or indeed deregulation more widely, from the period before the establishment of TEXA. In other words, the period when we were formulating TEXA, moving towards a regulator. And I think we can look back and we can see some interesting problems at that point for which you could hardly blame TEXA, because TEXA didn't exist. And I think in that period when we were creating TEXA, there were some mistakes made which did help to create an atmosphere of misapprehension, which in the way that we're seeing, and I've said before, continues along. I think that at some of the initial stages there was a distinct lack of consultation, which is a bad thing in regulation. There was a preference for, I think, death by PowerPoint. There was a total lack of an idea of a regulatory partnership. In some quarters, there was the idea, we're the people designing the regulator, you are the regulatees, we will do the legislation, don't call us, we'll call you. I think there was a distinct lack, and this is going to be a theme, of a legislative philosophy. And there are two aspects of that. One is what you're regulating and how. Every regulator needs to have a regulatory psychology which goes way beyond the narrow stipulations of its legislation. And I think in the early stages of the TEXA formulation we lacked that, and indeed there wasn't a really clear idea of how we wanted to implement what we did think we wanted. We knew we wanted a risk regulator, but it was very difficult because this is quite a complex concept of what a risk regulator is and how you articulate that. Now, they're the negative lessons, if you like, from the pre-TEXA period. What I think is much, much more important is that there are some enormously positive lessons from the way in which TEXA was established, from which we need to draw at both government and sectoral level at this stage, both when we're thinking about how TEXA should continue, but also as we're continuing wider questions about the context of regulatory design. And what are the sort of things that emerged in that period that I think are positive? And I'd like to acknowledge here the heroic efforts by, I think, a handful of Commonwealth bureaucrats who really took a difficult situation and fundamentally got it back on track. I'm thinking of people like Lisa Schofield and David Hazelhurst and also Jessie Borthwick, who is in the audience today. I mean, this was a really, really good save, and I want to just talk about some of the things that were important. One is that we began real consultation. Not we're doing this and we're telling you, but we're thinking of this, what do you think about that? Secondly, we went into a legislative partnership. It wasn't the case that the universities would get distant communiques from Canberra. The universities were in the room as part of the drafting process with government. And I don't think there's anybody who would think that that legislative partnership did not improve the legislation. The third thing was that the legislation was shaped around a philosophy of regulation. It wasn't just a label, wasn't just a slogan that we wanted a risk regulator. There was a philosophy of regulation embedded in the legislation. And I have to tell you, and I know that this is not a universally popular term for that philosophy, but it was light touch regulation. Let me put that again in a calmer, perhaps more nuanced way. Light touch regulation. That was the philosophy that higher education is a given good. A regulatory system relating to a given good is there to promote it, not suppress it. And so in reacting to risk under such a philosophy, you will make the smallest possible interference in relation only to real and demonstrable risk. And as a result of that, that philosophy was in turn actually defined and expressed in the legislation, and in turn defined what risk regulation meant. And that was done in the three basic principles of the Act: regulatory necessity, reflection of risk, and proportionality to risk. And the final point was that by having defined that philosophy, you had effectively defined the regulatory psychology of TEXA. It had the psychology of a light touch regulator regulating a good thing towards its promotion. Now, I want to talk about that regulatory psychology because I think that's absolutely vital. It's applicable not only to TEXA, but it's applicable more widely to the whole higher education regulatory system. And it's applicable particularly at a time where a government and a minister is interested in the concept of deregulation. Now, I, for my sins, have designed a lot of regulators in my life. I've designed regulators for lawyers, I've designed regulators for real estate agents, I have even famously designed regulators for brothels. I've set up tribunals, I've been there, I understand this stuff. Legislation is vital, but you can draft the best legislation in the world and it will not work unless the implementation works. And the most important thing in the implementation of a regulator is its regulatory psychology. In other words, what the regulator thinks it's doing and why, and what its objectives are. And that fundamentally has to depend on the subject that you are regulating. For example, if you were to set up the cane toad authority, it would come as no surprise to you to realise that the correct supposition for the regulator was that cane toads were bad things that should be suppressed, and the regulatory psychology should therefore be tough and retributive. That's the way it should work. In the case of higher education, and I speak particularly from the perspective of universities, the regulative philosophy should be that these things are good to be promoted, and therefore the regulatory approach should be within reason and the bounds of assurance, light and permissive. And that regulatory psychology is applicable well beyond the particular case of TEXA to all elements of higher education regulation. And that is vital because even if you get a regulator with the right legislation enshrining the right philosophy, it will not work unless the regulatory psychology, the regulatory atmosphere is correct. And so, from my point of view, it is reasonable to draw certain lessons from that process of the establishment of TEXA that I went through that seem to me absolutely indispensable in the assurance of the type of psychology that I have been talking about. That consultation is vital. That legislative and reform formulation should be in partnership between the sector and the regulator. When I say the sector, I don't just mean universities. That legislation must have a clear regulatory philosophy, and that philosophy is, and we can argue about the terminology forever, but light touch, that philosophy itself must be reflected in the regulatory psychology as embedded and as in practice day to day. Now, my real criticism of TEXA, and this is not the sort of extravagant criticism that I have been myself criticising, comes as a critical friend. That's what I am towards TEXA. I don't think TEXA has got its regulatory psychology entirely right. And I think that's been reflected in some of its biggest difficulties. The occasional intrusive informational sally, for example, the third-party arrangements, more often, and I think this is quite sad, in a certain steely rhetoric about the erotic joys of being a regulator, which are not actually reflected in steely regulatory decisions that are unreasonable and unfair. In fact, the rhetoric which often creates the trouble is not reflected in negative action that is actually taken, but gives a field day to critics to present TEXA as a sort of a Stalinist tractor factory. Now, the reality, I believe, is, as I said, that TEXA's intended regulatory psychology was light touch regulation. I say that not without fear of contradiction, because I know I will be contradicted, but I will say this to you again in an uncompromising way. I was there. I was in the room, and I know what was meant to happen. And we have to move back to that position because it is clearly reflected in the three basic principles of the Act, and it could not be clearer. And I hate to admit this, but I committed the last refuge of an academic scoundrel in preparing this. I actually did some research. And I went to the TEXA website, and there are nice little things that if you're competent you can pull down, which excludes me, but I tried. It is interesting that under regulatory approach, I could find no reference to the three basic principles. I'm sure they're there somewhere on the TEXA legislation, in the TEXA website. The TEXA Act is there, so it would be there. Is it not remarkable that in a regulator bound by three basic principles, they are not front and centre in the simple statement of the regulatory approach? And that is one of the reasons why I'm delighted to see the terms of the Minister's instructions very clearly on regulation in this issue, continually referring to TEXA as a body not of regulation but of deregulation, a body of permission rather than prohibition. And I believe that the job is not to hurt TEXA, not to dissolve TEXA, not to criticise TEXA, but to simply recalibrate TEXA on the right track. Track the right regulatory psychology. It's not about recasting TEXA, it's simply about adjusting it. And if you look at the discussion papers that TEXA have put out, all of the proposals are going in the right direction. All of the proposals are calling for less information, cutting red tape, better regulatory processes, more streamlining. They're all clearly more burdensome. I would prefer, and I'm publicly on record as saying I would prefer, that universities had an earned autonomy model, but that's a matter for a later day. But I'm saying all of these things are in the right direction, but none of them will work unless the regulatory psychology is correct. If you have a restrictive regulatory psychology, no amount of deregulatory steps will make any difference. And so I believe the fundamental job for TEXA, well within its capacity, well within its significant talents, is to get its regulatory mind in the right zone. And if that happens, I think there will be less miscarriages of rhetoric, and it will starve critics of TEXA of the ammunition that they have been using. But TEXA has to admit that it is being created by a regulator, by legislation. It is, in the way we lawyers say it, and we pronounce it in a particular way, a creature, a creation of the three basic principles. The three basic principles of light touch regulation. Now, I think there's one other fundamental step for TEXA, which is drawn from the lessons that I've already tried to outline, and that is it has to re-engage with the sector in making changes. Now, I don't mean by that PowerPoint consultation, I mean ongoing engagement in the room. The type of partnership in design we had 2 years ago that worked so well, that can inject industry knowledge, mutual implication into complicated problems and trust. And that is going to have to be ongoing far beyond a 6-week or any other week consultation period. That has to be part of the life of a national regulator of something as important as higher education. And I would say here quite clearly, this is all being said by me personally, not in any one of the many miserable hats I wear, that it is perfectly clear to me that Universities Australia, there are other groups that must be included in this, are not simply one industry group for this purpose. Universities Australia, not as a board member but as an observer, is the foundation of higher education in this country, of bodies with unique governance of a constitutional character. Doesn't mean that other bodies should not be engaged fully but this is fundamental. So my operative conclusion with TEXA is there must be a TEXA, there must be a national regulator, and the two vital ingredients for success is the reinstatement of its regulatory psychology and its ongoing partnership with the sector in this current change process. Without those two things, I see no point in a consultative engagement between the sector and TEXA. There must be those two critical commitments to make it work, and the consequences of failure are huge. The unfair criticism will continue, the regulator will be undermined, and as the regulator is undermined, so is the regulation and so is the sector. Now, having said that, can I say one final thing at a little length about something I think really should be happening in wider higher education regulation. We're in a very interesting space at the moment. We've got a government and a minister clearly committed to deregulation of higher education. Now, I confine this to universities for the moment as a university person. It seems to me that there are always three very good reasons why deregulation and universities go together. One is because from deregulation comes diversity and freedom, and from them come innovation and productivity. Secondly, by and large, universities have a strong history of responsible behaviour and governance. We are not, I hope, cane toads. But the third one, and at the most fundamental level, comes from classical liberal theory, that government is not only about power, as expressed in regulation, but also about the guarantee of liberty and freedom, as expressed in deregulation. Now, that's all very highfalutin, but let me put this to you quite clearly, because I don't think we put it very clearly or well at all at the time TEXA was being formulated. Universities are indispensable elements of the Australian and the British and the Western concept of freedom. Independent constitutional entities with unique governance, very irritating, I admit, but guaranteeing a standing critique of society as a whole, and not just any particular government, but government generally. They are vital to balanced government. Now, given that reality, there is a huge opportunity at this time of philosophical reflection on regulation of higher education to supply a missing piece of what I would call the meta-governance of higher education and universities. We have seen the dangers when the regulatory psychology in relation to universities is to some degree deficient, even where that degree of deficiency is exaggerated. The truth is, notwithstanding everything I've said about the position of universities, the closest attempt we have ever come in law to define what is special about universities in our system, ironically, is the three basic principles in the TEXA Act. And the Charter of Importance of Universities should not be placed in the Act creating their regulator. This is a fundamental proposition that belongs in a far more fundamental place. Now, it's clear to me as a constitutional lawyer, and as you know, constitutional lawyers are infallible, that the Commonwealth has legislative authority both under the Corporations Power and probably under the implied power from nationhood to pass a Short Universities Act recognising and celebrating the fundamental character of universities in an appropriate place, acknowledging their autonomy subject to law within the regulatory envelope that the Commonwealth imposes and within absolute government control of funding as self-accrediting institutions, free in what they teach, in what they research, in who they enrol, and in who they hire. And if we had an act like that standing alongside or perhaps above the TEXA legislation, then indeed we would permanently establish a regulatory psychology of higher education. without in any way compromising the power of the Commonwealth to set directions for the sector. Now, it seems to me that moving beyond TEXA, moving beyond the particular issues we have, that would be a keystone of higher education deregulatory innovation that certainly would be a fit project for a government that sees itself as the heirs of Menzies and the establishment of the Australian higher education system in its modern form. And I would strongly recommend it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter McCallum from the University of Sydney. It seems to me another aspect that has become a little bit blurred in the last period is that we all, of course, have risk registers in our universities, and most of those risks are not suitable things to be governed by any kind of central regulation at all. Would you like to say a few words about what risks that universities carry are appropriate targets for regulation, and what really are risks which ought to be rightly borne by the institution on the assumption that if they don't attend to them, they will fail?
I think it's a question of balance. And I think that's where you come back to that idea of regulatory psychology. There are, I think, some things that you can regulate, but I actually think that simply seeing TEXA, for example, as a regulator is probably a little narrow, even though I've done it myself today because that's the way it's usually done. There is also such a thing as an assurer. An assurer is different to a regulator. It's at a significantly lower level. And it seems to me, in my mind, that the object of an assurer is not in fact to regulate, to stipulate, to designate what an authority does. It is simply to make sure by assurance of process that the capacities of that own body are in fact being directed towards those types of questions. It seems to me that in relation to universities, where this meets is the crucial concept of governance. People often say, what is the difference between universities and other bodies? And the thing that they may often come up with is research. That is a fundamental difference, but I think that the concept of university governance is far more fundamental. That idea of independent governance, and may I say hideously complex governance, which is designed precisely, and if we think of academic boards, they're probably the very, very apogee of this, to assure certain things. Now, it's really, it seems to me, a question of levels here. Many people who would be very, very worried about TEXA regulating 15 of 27 topics would have no great difficulties at all a hands-off regulator sitting over the top and simply making sure that the governance processes of universities, which is not going to take a lot of time or difficulty, are in fact typically meeting those types of things. But if you say that there are particular things that are not easily assured by a regulator, of course that's the case. I mean, the most obvious example is academic freedom. I mean, how on earth is a regulator going to assure or regulate academic freedom? How is it going to do the same things in relation to particular aspects of research? I think there are strands that need to be separated out of this. It doesn't touch my own idea that there does need to be some overall regulatory system, but with perhaps a somewhat more refined idea of what it's doing.
Thank you, Professor Craven. You actually touched on what I was going to ask, and that is that, as I said, the important feature in partnership is actually looking at developing capacity within institutions to do their own self-regulation, and you did talk about that. You talked about the psychology that needs to be right for the regulator? Who's going to provide the counselling?
I think the thing to do with those types of legislation is you have to set up the legislation in such a way that it promotes the psychology. And there is the question of what happens if the psychology is not sufficiently calibrated. My own view of these matters is, at the end of the day, government is ultimately responsible for the effective operation of any regulator and of any regulatory system, because regulatory systems are set up by enactment, and enactments are a matter of the sovereign parliament of the Commonwealth in this case. So I think that there is a real role for government. Having worked in ministerial offices and premiers, I have seen many attempts by ministers to separate themselves from regulators who are in difficulty. I've never seen any of them work. So it seems to me we have to remember that no matter how independent a regulator is, no matter how independent a regulator is, if that regulator is regulating something of fundamental policy, and there's nothing much more fundamental than higher education, ultimate responsibility under our Westminster system devolves upon Her Majesty's Ministers for State.
Thank you, Professor Craven. The question I have is, you've proposed a separate legislative instrument for the philosophy, the regulatory philosophy, and I'm certainly no constitutional lawyer expert, but I was wondering how you think that would have changed the way in which TEXA would have approached things had that been set up from the start.
I always thought that one of the problems with TEXA was that we were dealing with a series of very, very real problems, but we weren't sure of the fundamental context. We could understand we had overseas students, we needed to assure it. We could understand we were expanding the system, we needed to assure it. We could understand we were expanding the scope of the system. All of these things are good reasons to assure, but I'm not sure we articulated as clearly to ourselves what the system was itself that we were trying to assure. If you're saying, I don't want my dog to have fleas, okay, you don't want your dog to have fleas. There's actually a wider, higher purpose there, which is that you want your dog to be comfortable. And there's one above that, which is I like dogs. And there's probably one above that, we should be kind to animals. Now, I think we came in at that lower level and we didn't have quite that clarity. Now, I think that was as much a problem and the fault of the universities as it was for anybody else. And the reason is, I think, if you want a thesis, that we've become so used to the idea that we're regulated by government, we're paid by government, that we've almost become quite confused about that higher purpose of universities and higher education. And to some extent, in the TEXA debate, you couldn't blame government for not starting to rave on about the independence of universities and this fundamental cultural value, when most of the vice-chancellors couldn't actually articulate it without blushing, because we spend most of our time worrying about money and sort of reputation and all the rest of it. I am a great believer that if you have fundamental legislation defining something, it does actually affect psychology. I mean, one of the examples is the freedom of information legislation. For all that we laugh about freedom of information, all that we know that it can be very, very challenging to make work, that legislation has very, very clear statements of philosophy in it, which over the past 30 years have fundamentally changed the nature of administration in Australia. And the same is true of the whole raft of Kerr Working Party reforms in administrative law at the Commonwealth. I think unless you get the meta-governance right, you won't get the minor governance right. I mean, my theory of why Australia has been an outstandingly successful democracy is not because we've had the best politicians in the world, not because we've had the best parliaments in the world, but we do have one of the best constitutions in the world. I think the same thing applies to universities. It's a fundamental conservative theory about the psychology of institutions, that if you set institutional psychology at the highest level, it will carry through.
One more question. I will have to make this the last. Thank you.
I'm interested in the psychology of TEXA. It's an institution in its own right, and its psychology is perhaps gone a bit skew if we sort of take your sort of presentation to be true, which I think was very good, so thank you. I sort of wonder, can the psychology be corrected within the parameters of TEXA as it currently stands, or do we need a new body, a HEXA, or some other kind of entity which can get the psychology right?
I mean, that's a hard question that has to be answered within the bounds of practicality. My publicly expressed preference, which I share with Professor Glyn Davis from Melbourne University, would be for a higher education commission of which TEXA was part. That's a settled preference. It's a settled preference for two reasons. It seems to me it gives TEXA a lot of cover, gives it more mates, it puts it in a context that's much more defensible. The other thing is that it does go to that regulatory psychology. One of the more interesting regulatory exercises I had to do was to amalgamate about, and I can't remember, 30 tribunals in Victoria into one tribunal now known as VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administration Tribunal. Now, some of you from Victoria may hate VCAT, but one of the problems with those former tribunals was that many of them were so small and so isolated that their regulatory psychology had become balkanised. It was terribly focused on one thing, and they didn't have a sense of the wider game in terms of administrative justice. I actually think it would be much better for TEXA to be located like that, given what I'm saying. That's an ideal situation. I think it is perfectly possible to, and I use the word quite consciously, recalibrate TEXA, because we're talking about calibration. We're not talking about a mutant regulator that's sort of running around, biting babies from higher education. It is possible to recalibrate it. I think it does take a little bit of legislative work. I think it cannot be done without those two things that I've said. You have to have that willingness to recalibrate the psychology, and you have to have that ongoing legislative partnership. Otherwise, there's no point trying. But given those things, it can be done. I think if you wanted to take the game to the whole next level without creating a higher education commission, without any of those highly complicated things, the thing that you could do quite easily, I think to almost universal acclaim, would be a Universities Act. I could write it for you in 2 pages. It would not constrain the Commonwealth, but it would make it very clear why we have universities, where they fit, and what the regulatory psychology should be.